Hey, crew. It's Pitt, and I'm back with some more psychology. Today, we are diving back into the works of Carl Jung. We will be reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text from concerning rebirth. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the box down below so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. If you find value, I ask that you do all of the wonderful things down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow. Throw me a comment, whether you agree or disagree with anything that is stated. If you put it in the box and it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. In addition to that, if you truly find value, uh, I ask that you give me a like. I lost my entire train of thought. I forgot to set the comments up before we started. If you truly find value, I ask that you give me a super thanks. Consider joining for a membership or picking up a copy of one of my books. The ones most relevant to today is going to be the series of Unconventional Beliefs or The Green Stone, both of which are dealing with spiritual alchemy from slightly different viewpoints. The first one details more how I went about learning to heal myself and how you can too. And the second one is a bit more technical, a little bit more precise. With all of that being said, we are going to dive in and begin the exploration of concerning rebirth from Carl Jung. Oh, glasses. This paper represents the substance of a lecture, which I delivered on the spur of the moment at the Aranos meeting in 1939. In putting it into written form, I've made use of the stenographic notes which were taken at the meeting. Certain portions had to be omitted, chiefly because of the requirements of a printed text are different from those of the spoken word. However, so far as possible, I've carried out my original intention in summing up the content of my lecture on the theme of rebirth, and have also endeavored to reproduce my analysis of the 18th surah of the Quran as an example of a rebirth mystery. I have added some references to source materials which the reader may welcome. My summary does not purport to be more than a survey of a field of knowledge, which can only be treated very superficially in the framework of a lecture. Carl Jung. All right. I thought that was the beginning. All right. Forms of rebirth. I had to get new glasses out next to my bed. Nice. That is very amazing, Jason. I am so very glad to hear that. That is very, very good stuff. Yeah, that is amazing. Excellent. The concept of rebirth is not always used in the same sense. Since this concept has various aspects, it may be useful to review its different meanings. The 5 different forms which I am going to enumerate could probably be added to if one were to go into greater detail. But I venture to think that my definitions cover at least the cardinal meanings. In the first part of my exposition, I give a brief summary of the different forms of rebirth, while the second part presents its various psychological aspects. In the third part, I give an example of a rebirth mystery from the Quran. 1. Metempsychosis. The first of the 5 aspects of rebirth to which I would like to draw attention is to that of metempsychosis, or transmigration of souls. According to this view, one's life is prolonged in time by passing through different bodily existences, or, from another point of view, it is a life sequence interrupted by different reincarnations. Even in Buddhism, where this doctrine is of particular importance, the Buddha himself experienced a very long sequence of such rebirths. It is by no means certain whether continuity of a personality is guaranteed or not. There may be only a continuity of karma. The Buddha's disciples put this question to him during his lifetime, but he never made any definite statement as to whether there is or is not a continuity of personality. I'm going to hold mine until we get through with this section, and then I will talk about what I believe in the area of rebirth on the soul. 2, reincarnation. This concept of rebirth necessarily implies the continuity of personality. Here, the human personality is regarded as continuous and accessible to memory, so that When one is incarnated or born, one is able, at least potentially, to remember that one has lived through previous existences and that these existences were one's own. An example, that they had the same ego form as the present life. As a rule, reincarnation means rebirth in a human body. 3. Resurrection. This means a reestablishment of human existence after death. A new element enters here, that of the change, transmutation, or transformation of one's being. The change may be either essential, in the sense that the resurrected being is a different one, or non essential, in the sense that only the general conditions of existence have changed, as when one finds oneself in a different place or in a body which is differently constituted. It may be a carnal body, as in the Christian assumption that the body will be resurrected. On a higher level, the process is no longer understood in a gross material sense. It is assumed that the resurrection of the dead is the raising up of the corpus glorificantius, the subtle body, in the state of incorruptibility. 4. Rebirth, renovatio. The fourth form concerns rebirth in the strict sense, that is to say, rebirth within the span of individual life. The English word rebirth is the exact equivalent of the German Wiederbunkt, Wiederbirth, but the French language seems to lack a term having the particular meaning of rebirth. This word has a special flavor. Its whole atmosphere suggests an idea of renovatio, renewal, or even improvement, brought about by magical means. There you go. Rebirth may be a renewal without any change of being, inasmuch as the personality which is renewed is not changed in its essential nature, but only its functions, or parts of the personality, are subjected to healing, strengthening, or improvement. And thus, even bodily ills may be healed through rebirth ceremonies. Indeed, indeed. Another aspect of this fourth form is essential transformation. An example, total rebirth of the individual. Here, the renewal implies a change of the essential nature and may be called a transmutation. Indeed, indeed. As examples, we may mention the transformation of a mortal being into an immortal being, of a corporeal being into a spiritual being, and of a human being into a divine being. Well known prototypes of this change are the transfiguration and ascension of Christ, and the assumption of the Mother of God into heaven after her death, together with her body. Similar conceptions are to be found in Part 2 of Goethe's Faust. For instance, the transformation of Faust into the boy and then into Dr. Moranius. Generally, an alteration of physicality will follow an alteration of psyche, but the transformation is not instantaneous. One may not even notice, except in retrospect. That is very true. Like, I have noticed about myself, right? When I decided that I was going to begin exercise, my body began transforming itself. When I decided to begin running, it transformed itself in a whole different way. And then when I started expanding those exercises into the chin ups and pull ups and planks and stuff, it then molded itself in a whole different way. But like for the first couple of weeks, I set the pattern that I wanted to do this thing. And then my body made me wait like a week or two before I could continue. And then after it had adjusted to the changes that I was trying to make, I was able to pick it up again and do it more effectively. And that is a very interesting phenomenon. Oh, very interesting. 5. Participation in the process of transformation. The fifth and last form is indirect rebirth. Here, the transformation is brought about not directly by passing through death and rebirth oneself, but indirectly by participating in a process of transformation which is conceived of as taking place outside the individual. In other words, one has to witness or take part in some rite of transformation. This rite may be a ceremony such as the Mass, where there is a transformation of substances. Through his presence at the rite, the individual participates in divine grace. Similar transformations of the deity are to be found in the pagan mysteries. There, too, the initiate, sharing the experience, is vouchsafed the gift of grace, as we know from the Eleusinian mysteries. A case in point is the confession of the initiate in the Eleusinian mysteries, who praises the great conferred through the certainty of immortality. Okay, my turn. Uh, I believe that there is a God, right? And because of that, I look at things through a different lens. My God does not incarnate, right? If you can see it, it's of God, but it is not God. If you could ever see it, if it was ever able to be audibly heard, if you could smell it, taste it, touch it, anything with the actual senses, it's not God, right? God is that still small voice that speaks to you inside, and it is all of existence, everything. But you, as a soul, are an individual sliver of God, a little tiny fraction just sliced off and said, okay, here you go. Here's life. Here's the parameters of existence. You are on this planet. Go and make a life. And so you, as the individual, get to choose between good and bad, right and wrong, whatever the situation is, and however it plays out. There are some empirical no's, right? Do not kill. That's a no. Don't do that. Right? And then there are some things that are up for grabs, right? The way that you view anything that happens after death is entirely dependent upon you and the lens that you use. I am not here to tell you necessarily that you are wrong. I have given my reasons for believing why I do what I do, and why I can't what some other people do. And that was the point of those things. Your expression of the divine and my expression of the divine doesn't have to be the same, but we all believe that we have a soul, and that soul is here incarnated, right? I believe that the body is the temple of God given to you to navigate through space with. Now, I believe we're in 5D space, and that sets me apart from some other people too, but we have the ability to think in time, and those are dimensions. We are here to have experiences. That is the whole point of slivering us off from the divine. The divine can't know grief, right? If you die, you go back to the divine. He's not sad about it. You're coming home. Whenever you have joy, that's something that the divine really can experience in the way that we do, because everything's joyful to him, right? And our concept of God needs to be outside of the creation, not inside of the creation. But we are here to have an experience of life. Go forth, multiply, subdue the earth, be stewards thereof, shed no blood of man. Right? That is the mission, to do these things, to be the best that you can, to have the best experience you can in the most positive way that you can, to influence the most lives that you possibly can in the most positive way that you can, to be that light that is the divine here on earth. That is everyone's goal, and we all fall short of being that light. The best we can do sometimes is to reflect a little bit of it so that other people can find their way to the real light. We're here as the expressions, and I believe that because we are here having this experience, we agreed before we got here to certain lessons. Some of those lessons are wonderful, and some of those lessons are pretty terrible, right? Finding the love of your life, living for 40 or 50 years together, and dying peacefully, right? That is a wonderful experience. And some people have that. Some people don't. Some people have really terrible experiences that are marked by pain and grief, but they are all equally experiences for the divine. And you agreed to have certain experiences before you got here. We all are an expression of the divine, and whether or not my soul is going to be reincarnated into a new body exactly with my psyche, or if it's an altered psyche, or if it exists right now, if you are a different expression of my soul at a different point in time, these are possibilities, and we will never know. But what we can know is that we are here to be the example of the best we can be, to show how God can be expressed through the mortal in the best way possible, to be kind to people, to act as if everyone is human, to be moderate in our ways, to be generous in our actions, to be patient with our speech, to be faithful with our actions, to be lost one, and to be purposeful with your life. can do these things, if you can align yourself so that you can do those things, then you can be that light. You can be the reflection of the light at least. And that is everyone's goal. That is what everyone is supposed to do. And we all, every single one of us falls short of that. But we can be that light if we can learn how to balance ourselves to be that light. The good experiences, the bad experiences, they are all valuable. And I believe that they are all going back and getting written into the people who we were and being used for the people who will come through instinctual reactions. The video yesterday, right? It is instinctually written onto you to know what a good mother is, right? It is instinctually written into you to know what a good father is. And that is why when we fall short of that, we develop some neuroses about that, right? We have, through amalgamation over the years and evolution, have written into the DNA that we should have these things. And when we don't, it reverberates in us. And we can learn to identify these things. We can learn to balance these things, and it can all get better. That's my view on the soul, right? If I can be the best example that I am, if I can align myself towards God in the best way that I can, if I can impact the most people in the most positive way that I can, if I can be that example, then it doesn't matter what happens on the other side. I doubt that it's fire. I really do, but I can't know that, right? And I can't tell you that you were wrong if you believe that because I can't know that. I can give my reasons why not, but I have no right to try to force them upon you. We're here to be the best example for God as we can. And if there is a rebirth on that side, then so be it. But there is a rebirth on this side. Right? You can change who you were into who you want to be. You can do that for yourself through the will of God. I absolutely always emphatically say that. But it is you putting in the work. It is you deciding, I am tired of this. It is you deciding, you know what? Something has to change. This is done in my life today. And if you don't have that, nobody can force that on you. Nobody can make you go to rehab and it stick. Nobody can make you succeed in your life. You have to want it. But if you want it, you can have it. You can change. And the only thing that has ever been required for that was the desire, was for you to express it. Now, I believe that you need to confess, right? You need to tell God, I messed up. Here is exactly where I messed up. I am sorrowful for it, and I am going to change my life. And if you do that, everything else is done, right? You move forward from that new, reborn from there. There is no need for any animal to die. There's no need for any person to die. There's no need for any intercession ever at any point in time. It is you and the Creator always at every point in time. That's where I stand. Right? That is my viewpoint on rebirth. And hopefully, that's not too confusing. Moreover, even if there is a rebirth after this experience, we have no ability to act in that time. Today is the time that we can act. Absolutely. Right? We are responsible for our actions here today. All right, the psychology of rebirth. Rebirth is not a process that we can in any way observe. We can neither measure nor weigh nor photograph it. It is entirely beyond perception. We have to do here with a purely psychic reality, which is transmitted to us only indirectly through personal statements. One speaks of rebirth, one professes rebirth, one is filled with rebirth. This we accept as sufficiently real. We are not concerned here with the question, is rebirth a tangible process of some sort? We have to be content with its psychic reality. I hasten to add that I am not alluding to the vulgar notion that anything psychic is either nothing at all or, at best, even more tenuous than a gas. Quite the contrary, I am of the opinion that the psyche is the most tremendous fact of human life. Indeed, it is the mother of all human facts, of civilization, and of its destroyer, war. All this is at first psychic and invisible. So long as it is merely psychic, it cannot be experienced by the senses, but is nonetheless indisputably real. The mere fact that people talk about rebirth and that there is such a concept at all means that the store of psychic experiences designated by that term must actually exist. What these experiences are like, we can only infer from the statements that have been made about them. So, if we want to find out what rebirth really is, we must turn to history in order to ascertain what rebirth has been understood to mean. Rebirth is an affirmation that must be counted among the primordial affirmations of mankind. These primordial affirmations are based on what I call archetypes. And let's hit it real quick. I mean, archetypes are sets, right? They are not necessarily the individual things inside of the sets, but they are the sets themselves. Like I use glasses, and these are an individual pair of glasses. They are the set of this pair of glasses. But there is a set of all the possible glasses in the world. That set is the archetype of glasses. It contains the potential for any individual pair of glasses, but is not any of the individual pair of glasses. It is the potential for any of them to be perfect. And the perfect pair of glasses is the archetype of the ideal glasses used in Platonic language. In view of the fact that all affirmations relating to the sphere of the suprasensual are, in the last analysis, invariably determined by archetypes, it is not surprising that a concurrence of affirmations concerning rebirth can be found among the most widely differing peoples. There must be psychic events underlying these affirmations, which it is the business of psychology to discuss, without entering into all the metaphysical and philosophical assumptions regarding their significance. In order to obtain a general view of their phenomenology, it is necessary to sketch the whole field of transformation experiences in sharper outline. Two main groups of experience may be distinguished: that of the transcendence of life and that of one's own transformation. 1. Experience of the transcendence of life. A. Experiences induced by ritual. By the transcendence of life, I mean those aforementioned experiences of the initiate who takes part in the sacred rite, which reveals to him the perpetual continuation of life through transformation and renewal. In these mystery dramas, the transcendence of life, as distinct from its momentary concrete manifestations, is usually represented by the fateful transformations, death and rebirth, of a god or godlike hero. The initiate may either be a mere witness of the divine drama, or take part in it, or be moved by it. Or he may see himself identified through the ritual action with the god. In this case, what really matters is that an objective substance or form of life is ritually transformed through some process going on independently. While the initiate is influenced, impressed, consecrated, or granted divine grace on the mere grounds of his presence or participation, the transformation process takes place not within him, but outside him, although he may become involved in it. The initiate who ritually enacts the slaying, dismemberment, and scattering of Osiris, and afterwards his resurrection in the green wheat, experiences in this way the permanence and continuity of life, which outlast all changes of form and, phoenix like, continually rises anew from its own ashes. The participation in the ritual event gives rise, among other effects, to that hope of immortality which is characteristic of the Eleusinian mysteries. A living example of the mystery drama, representing the permanence as well as the transformation of life, is the Mass. If we observe the congregation during the sacred rite, we note all degrees of participation, from mere indifferent attendance to the profoundest emotion. The groups of men standing about near the exit, who are obviously engaged in every sort of worldly conversation, crossing themselves and genuflecting in a purely mechanical way, even they despite their inattention, participate in the sacral action by their mere presence in this place where grace abounds. The Mass is an extra mundane and extra temporal act in which Christ is sacrificed and then resurrected in the transformed substances. And this rite of his sacrificial death is not a repetition of the historical event, but the original, unique, and eternal act. The experience of the Mass is therefore a participation in the transcendence of life, which overcomes all bounds of space and time. It is a moment of eternity in time. It is the setting of mass attention. That is literally what it means. B. Immediate experiences. All that the mystery drama represents and brings about in the spectator may also occur in the form of spontaneous, ecstatic, or visionary experience without any ritual. Nietzsche's noontide vision is a classic example of this kind. Nietzsche, as we know, substitutes for the Christian mystery the myth of Dionysus Zagreus, who was dismembered and came to life again. His experience has the character of a Dionysian nature myth. The deity appears in the garb of nature, as classical antiquity saw it, and the moment of eternity is the noonday hour, sacred to Pan. Hath time flown away? Do I not fall? Have I not fallen? Hark! Into the well of eternity. Even the golden ring and the ring of eternity appears to him as a promise of resurrection and life. It is just as if Nietzsche had been present at a performance of the mysteries. Many mystic experiences have a similar character. They represent an action which, in the spectator, becomes involved, though his nature is not necessarily changed. In the same way, the most beautiful and impressive dreams often have no lasting or transformative effect on the dreamer. He may be impressed by them, but he does not necessarily see any problem in them. The event then naturally remains outside, like a ritual action performed by others. These more aesthetic forms of experience must be carefully distinguished from those which indubitably involve a change in one's nature. Subjective transformation. Transformations of personality are by no means rare occurrences. Indeed, they play a considerable role in psychopathology, although they are rather different from the mystical experiences just discussed, which are not easily accessible to psychological investigation. However, the phenomenon we are about to examine belongs to a sphere quite familiar to psychology. A. Diminution of personality. An example of the alteration of personality is the sense of diminution is furnished by what is known in the primitive psychology as loss of soul. The peculiar condition covered by this term is accounted for in the minds of the primitive by the supposition that a soul has just gone off, just like a dog that runs away from its master overnight. It is then the task of the medicine man to fetch the fugitive back. Often, the loss occurs suddenly and manifests itself in a general malaise. The phenomenon is closely connected with the nature of primitive consciousness, which lacks the firm coherence of our own. We have control over our willpower, but the primitive has not. Complicated exercises are needed if he is to pull himself together for any activity that is conscious and intentional and not just emotional and instinctive. Our consciousness is safer and more dependable in this respect, but occasionally something similar can happen to civilized man. Only he does not describe it as loss of soul, but as abaissement de niveau mental. Genet's apt term for this phenomenon. It is the slackening of the tensity of consciousness, which may be compared to a low barometric reading, presaging bad weather. The tonus has given way, and this is felt subjectively as listlessness, moroseness, and depression. One no longer has any wish or courage to face the task of the day. One feels like lead because no part of one's body seems willing to move. And this is due to the fact that one no longer has any disposable energy. This well known phenomenon corresponds to the primitive's loss of soul. The listlessness and paralysis of will can go so far that the whole personality falls apart, so to speak, and consciousness loses its unity. The individual parts of the personality make themselves independent and thus escape from the control of the conscious mind. As in the case of the anesthetic areas or systematic amnesias, the latter are well known as hysterical loss of function phenomena. This medical term is analogous to the primitive loss of soul. Abaissement de niveau mental can be the result of physical and mental fatigue, bodily illness, violent emotions, and shock, of which the last has a particularly deleterious effect on one's self assurance. The abaissement always has a restrictive influence of the personality as a whole. It reduces one's self confidence and the spirit of enterprise, and as a result of increasing egocentricity, narrows the mental horizon. In the end, it may lead to the development of an essentially negative personality, which means a falsification of the original personality has supervened. B. Enlargement of personality. The personality is seldom, in the beginning, what it will be later on. If you do it right. I know some people that have not evolved in 30 years. For this reason, the possibility of enlarging it exists, at least during the first half of life. The enlargement may be effected through an accretion from without by new vital contents finding their way into the personality from outside and being assimilated. In this way, a considerable increase of personality may be experienced. We therefore tend to assume that this increase comes only from without, thus justifying the prejudice that one becomes a personality by stuffing into oneself as much as possible from outside. But the more assiduously we follow this recipe, and the more stubbornly we believe that all increase has to come from without, the greater becomes our inner poverty. Therefore, if some great idea takes hold of us from outside, we must understand that it takes hold of us only because something in us responds to it and goes out to meet it. Richness of mind consists in mental receptivity, not the accumulation of possessions. What comes to us from outside, and for that matter, everything that rises up from within, can only be made our own if we are capable of an inner amplitude equal to that of the incoming content. If you can't match the frequency, you are not going to receive it. That's what he is saying right here, right? Richness in mind consists in mental receptivity and not the accumulation of possession. What comes to us from outside and everything that rises from within can only be ours if we are capable of an inner amplitude, matching the frequency of that incoming content. Get them harmonics kicking, baby. Real increase of personality means consciousness of an enlargement that flows from inner sources. Without psychic depth, we can never be adequately related to the magnitude of our object. It has therefore been said quite truly that a man grows with the greatness of his task, but he must have within himself the capacity to grow. Otherwise, even the most difficult task is of no benefit to him. More likely, he will be shattered by it, and so have a growth mindset. A classic example of enlargement is Nietzsche's encounter with Zarathustra, which made of the critic and a forest a tragic poet and prophet. Another example is St. Paul, who on his way to Damascus was suddenly confronted by Christ. True though it may be that this Christ of St. Paul's would hardly have been possible without the historical Jesus, the apparition of Christ came from St. Paul not from the historical Jesus, but from the depths of his own unconscious. That is true. When a summit of life is reached, when the bud unfolds and from the lesser the greater emerges, then, as Nietzsche says, one becomes two, and the greater figure, which one always was, but which remained invisible, appears to the lesser personality with the force of a revelation. He who is truly and hopelessly little will always drag the revelation of the greater down to the level of his littleness, and will never understand that the day of judgment for his littleness has dawned. But the man who is inwardly great will know that the long expected friend of his soul, the immortal one, has now really come to lead captivity captive. That is, to seize hold of him by whom this immortal had always been confined and held prisoner, and to make his life flow into that greater life. A moment of deadliest peril. Nietzsche's prophetic vision of the tightrope walker reveals the awful danger that lies in having a tightrope walking attitude towards an event which St. Paul gave the most exalted name he could find. Or his account was a total forgery. I am inclined to believe the second. There is that possibility as well, right? It, there is no internal consistency in Paul's account, right? We get three very separate accounts of that particular experience. In one, he hears it and nobody else does. He hears it and sees it and nobody else does. In another one, other people see it, but they don't hear it. And then in another one, they see it and hear it, but they don't understand it. That is three completely different ways of describing the exact same thing, supposedly from the same person. And so I too lean more towards it is not real. But I mean, and I have outlined that argument because it is most likely. Christ himself is the perfect symbol of the hidden immortal within the mortal man. Ordinarily, this problem is symbolized by a dual motif such as the Dioscuri, one of whom is mortal and the other immortal. The first bipole, meaning you got the monad, you get the duad. From the set that is the existence, creation, you get the first set past that is going to be positive and negative, immortal, mortal, material, spiritual, male, female. However you want to look at the original duad, that's what it breaks down to. From existence into polarity, from that attraction, and from that momentum, and from that response, and from that returns. It's really a process right down the chain of creation. An Indian parallel is the parable of the two friends. Behold, upon the selfsame tree, two birds, fast-bound companions, sit. This one enjoys the ripened fruit, the other looks but does not eat. On such a tree my spirit crouched, deluded by its powerlessness, till seeing with joy how great its Lord, it found from sorrow swift release. That's nice, I like that. Another notable parallel is the Islamic legend of the meeting of Moses and Khadir, to which I shall return later on. Naturally, the transformation of personality in this enlarging sense does not occur only in the form of such highly significant experiences. There is no lack of more trivial instances, a list of which could easily be compiled from the clinical history of neurotic patients. Indeed, any case where the recognition of a greater personality seems to burst an iron ring round the heart must be included in this category. Sorry. C. Change of internal structure. We must now come to changes of personality which imply neither enlargement nor diminution, but structural alteration. One of the most important forms of this phenomena, of possession. Some content, an idea, or a part of the personality obtains mastery of the individual for one reason or another. The contents which thus take possession appear as peculiar convictions, idiosyncrasies, stubborn plans, and so forth. As a rule, they are not open to correction. One has to be an especially good friend of the possessed person and willing to put up with almost anything if one is to attempt to deal with such a condition. I am not prepared to lay down any hard and fast line of demarcation between possession and paranoia. Possession can be formulated as identity of the ego personality with a complex. Good morning, guys. A common instance of this identity with the persona, which is the individual's system of adaptation to, or the manner he assumes in dealing with, the world. Every calling or profession, for example, has its own characteristic persona. It is easy to study these things nowadays when the photographs of certain public personalities so frequently appear in the press. A certain kind of behavior is forced on them by the world, and professional people endeavor to come up to these expectations. Only the danger is that they become identical with their personas, the professor with his textbook, the tenor with his voice. The damage is done. Henceforth, he lives exclusively against the background of his own biography. For by that time, it is written. Then he went to such and such a place and said this or that, etc. The garment of Deianira has grown fast to his skin, and a desperate decision, like that of Heracles, is needed if he is to tear this Nessus shirt from his body and step into the consuming fire of the flame of immortality in order to transform himself into what he really is. One could say, with a little exaggeration, that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. In any case, the temptation to be what one seems to be is great because the persona is usually rewarded in cash. Well, there you go. There are still other factors which may take possession of the individual, one of the most important being the so called inferior function. This is not the place to enter into a detailed discussion of this problem. I should only like to point out that the inferior function is practically identical with the dark side of the human personality. See either one of those two books I mentioned at the beginning. We discussed that in some greater detail. That's the bottom part of the stack, right? The inferior function is the bottom part of the stack. The darkness which clings to every personality is the door into the unconscious, exactly right, and the gateway of dreams into the subconscious, which is on the other side of the stack. From the which those two twilight figures, the shadow and the anima, step into our nightly visions, or remaining invisible, take possession of our ego consciousness. And here is his fundamental problem. This is a fundamental problem. The anima is the spirit. We have discovered that going along, which means that it is the creative facilitator of creation, right? You have the body, which is the physical result of what has been created. You have the soul, which we had a great discussion about earlier, which is the decider of fate. You decide between positive and negative. But that positive and negative, those options, that is the spirit. That is the anima. And it is both the shadow and the light, right? Separating the shadow from the spirit is what would be the right terminology for that? It would be taking it away from its proper place. It's separating the polarities. It's completely against the fundamentals of creation, right? It is the fundamental problem that we face in understanding these things. You cannot separate the dark and the light. One does not exist without the other. The only way to healthily get this into accordance is to consider both of them and to bring them into balance in your life. You need your shadow side. It's helpful. It doesn't need to domineer you, right? The same is true with the light. You are the salt and the light. That is correct. Exclusive, exclusive what? I don't know what the exclusive is for. Um, okay. Step into our nightly visions, remain invisible, ego consciousness. A man who is possessed by his shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into his own traps. Whenever possible, he prefers to make an unfavorable impression on others. In the long run, luck is always against him because he is living below his own level and at best only attains what does not suit him. And if there is no doorstep for him to stumble over, he manufactures one for himself and then fondly believes that he has done something useful. Possession caused by the anima or animus presents a different picture. Above all, this transformation of personality gives prominence to those traits which are characteristic of the opposite sex. In man, the feminine traits, and in woman, the masculine. That's not possession. In the state of possession, both figures lose their charm and their values. They retain them only when they are turned away from the world in the introverted state, when they serve as bridges to the unconscious. Turned towards the world, the anima is fickle, capricious, moody, uncontrolled, and emotional, sometimes gifted with demonic intuitions, ruthless, malicious, untruthful, bitchy, double faced, and mystical. The animus is obstinate, harping on principles, laying down the law, dogmatic, world reforming, theoretic, word mongering, argumentative, and domineering. That is the decider, right? Anima is the facilitator, the thing that makes it happen, but the animus is the thing that makes the decision. That should be the soul. Both alike have bad taste. The animus surrounds herself with inferior people, and the animus lets himself be taken in by second rate thinking or tempted by the lower web. Okay. Another form of structural change concerns certain unusual observations, about which I speak only with the utmost reserve. I refer to states of possession in which the possessed is caused by something that could perhaps most fitly be described as an ancestral soul, by which I mean the soul of some definite forebear. For all practical purposes, such cases may be regarded as striking instances of identification with deceased persons. Naturally, the phenomena of identity only occur after the ancestor's death. My attention was first drawn to such possibilities by Leon Daude's confused but ingenious book, Le Heredo. Daudet supposes that in the structure of the personality there are ancestral elements which, under certain conditions, may suddenly come to the fore. The individual is then precipitatively thrust into an ancestral role. Now we know that ancestral roles play a very important part in primitive psychology. Not only are ancestral spirits supposed to be reincarnated in children, but an attempt is made to implant them into the child by naming him after an ancestor. So, too, primitives try to change themselves back into their ancestors by means of certain rites. I would mention, certainly, especially, the Australian conception of the Alkeringaminja, ancestral souls, half man and half animal, whose reactivation through religious rites is of the greatest functional significance for the life of the tribe. Ideas of the sort dating back to the Stone Age were widely diffused, as may be seen from numerous other traces that can be found elsewhere. It is therefore not improbable that these primordial forms of experience may recur, even today, as cases of identification with ancestral souls. And I believe I have seen such cases. In those words, both the positive and the negative together when examined from the roots of the language. Huh. I haven't done an etymology on that. Hmm. Identification with a group. We shall now discuss another form of transformation experience, which I would call identification with a group. More accurately speaking, it is the identification of an individual with a number of people who, as a group, have a collective experience of transformation. Your tribe. This special psychological situation must not be confused with participation in a transformation rite, which, though performed before an audience, does not in any way depend upon group identity or necessarily give rise to it. To experience transformation in a group and to experience it in oneself are two totally different things? Yes. If any considerable group of persons are united and identified with one another by a particular frame of mind, the resultant transformation experience bears only a very remote resemblance to the experience of individual transformation. A group experience takes place on a lower level of consciousness than the experience of the individual. Yes, all the way down in the binary. This is due to the fact that when many people gather together to share one common emotion, the total psyche emerging from the group is below the level of the individual psyche. If if it is a very large group, the collective psyche will be more like the psyche of an animal, which is the reason why the ethical attitude of large organizations is always doubtful. The psychology of a large crowd inevitably sinks to the level of mob psychology. If therefore I have a so called collective experience as a member of a group, it takes place on a lower level of consciousness than if I had the experience by myself alone. That is why this group experience is very much more frequent than an individual experience of transformation. It is also much easier to achieve because the presence of so many people together exerts great suggestive force. That is another absolute truth. The individual in a crowd easily becomes the victim of his own suggestibility. It is only necessary for something to happen. For instance, a proposal backed by the whole crowd, and we too are all for it, even if the proposal is immoral. In the crowd, one feels no responsibility, but also no fear. And then add into that some breath manipulation, right? Getting people to take deep breaths and expel them in certain tones repeatedly over an extended period of time to produce a euphoric situation and then introduce this. Yeah, that happens weekly, at least. Thus, identification with the group is a simple and easy path to follow, but the group experience goes no deeper than the level of one's own mind in that state. It does work a change in you, but the change does not last. On the contrary, you must have continual recourse to mass intoxication in order to consolidate the experience and your relief in it. But as soon as you are removed from the crowd, you are a different person again and unable to reproduce the previous state of mind. That is why you must go all of the time. The mass is swayed by participation mystique. It is inducing participation mystique, which is nothing other than the unconscious identity. Supposing, for example, you go to the theater, glance meets glance. Everybody observes everybody else, so that all those who are present are caught up in an invisible web of mutual unconscious relationship. If this condition increases, one literally feels borne along by the universal wave of identity with others. It may be a pleasant feeling, one sheep among 10,000. Again, if I feel that this crowd is a great and wonderful unity, I am a hero, exalted along with the group. When I am myself again, I discover that I am Mr. So and so and that I live in such and such a street on the third floor. And I find that the whole affair was really most delightful, and I hope it will take place again tomorrow, so that I may once more feel myself to be a whole nation, which is much better than being just plain Mr. X. Since this is such an easy and convenient way of raising one's personality to more exalted rank, mankind has always formed groups, which make collective experiences of transformation, often of ecstatic nature, possible. The regressive identification with lower and more primitive states of consciousness is invariably accompanied by a heightened sense of life, hence the quickening effect of regressive identifications with half animal ancestors in the Stone Age group. Good and evil. So, this explains why governments, no matter how well and just, entered into ultimately become instruments of evil. Yeah, that's entropy, right? That is that is the populace not living up to their responsibilities. Right? Everybody wants to talk about their rights, but they don't want to do the responsibilities. Right? You want the right to express yourself freely, but you don't want to have the responsibility of ensuring that the people that you hate can also do so. Right? You want the ability to live how you want to live in the way that you want to live, but you don't necessarily want everybody else to follow those exact same rules. Right? And we need structure, right? People tend towards the bad if they are not intentionally going to the top, right? That's the entropy, right? And people are lazy. They don't want to do the hard thing, they want to do the easy thing. And so instead of being an informed electorate, right, knowing who the candidate is, what their stances are, and where you stand on those stances, instead we just vote according to a letter that's behind a name. And that person may or may not agree with you in any way, but my daddy voted this way, and so I have to vote this way. That's entropy, right? That is not taking responsibility for the exercise of your right. You are, you have rights. There are things that you should be able to do, and the government is there to protect you so that you can do those things. But other people have those too, and sometimes there's a clash, right? And people are going to tend towards the lazy, right? If you can make it easy for me to vote once a year, once every 4 years, just by putting a little letter behind there, then I don't have to do the research. I can trust that my group is going to tell me the right thing. And then we wind up in big trouble, right? And it's the same across a wide variety of things, right? And I don't put one particular party or the other one, right? I am very much in the middle. Like I had to register Republican because I could not be a Democrat. But like I don't agree with a lot of the stuff that Republicans do either. Once it becomes a thing, the thing has no more morality than an animal. Right. But that is what the owner of the animal, the people, is responsible for making sure. Like we should keep government as close to the local level as possible because that ensures a good deal of responsibility, right? If it's somewhere where I can see you, you're going to have to answer for your actions. If you're 1,000 miles away, maybe you don't. And so it should be as close to local as possible. People ought to remain responsible for the things they create. They're just lazy and immoral. That is true. Good into evil. That is entropy. Right? If you are not intentionally deciding to become better, you are slowly deciding to become worse. All right. The regress, I did that. Okay. The inevitable psychological regression within the group is partially counteracted by ritual. That is to say, through a cult ceremony, which makes the solemn performance of sacred events the center of group activity and prevents the crowd from relapsing into unconscious instinctuality by engaging the individual's interest and attention. The ritual makes it possible for him to have a comparatively individual experience, even within the group, and so to remain more or less conscious. But if there is no relation to his center which expresses the unconscious through its symbolism, the mass psyche inevitably becomes the hypnotic focus of fascination, drawing everyone under its spell. That is why masses are always breeding grounds of psychic epidemics, the events in Germany being a classic example of this. And that is one of the things, like I emphasize quite often, that who you surround yourself with is of vital importance in your life. If people are not aligned in the right way, you should not associate yourself with them. That does not mean that you are not friends, right? But that's not who you should be hanging around all of the time. If that is not the life that you want to lead, if they don't have at least the desire to make the life that you want to lead, because you can be on equal ground and all rise together. But if you are surrounded by four anchors, you will never rise. If you are the only one trying to rise, you will never get there. And if you are not surrounded by people who are willing to rise, you are holding yourself back. That doesn't mean just cut people out of your life. That doesn't mean anything along that nature. But the 5 people that you surround yourself with define who you will be. It will be objected to this essentially negative evaluation of mass psychology that there are also positive experiences. For instance, a positive enthusiasm which spurs the individual to noble deeds, or an equally positive feeling of human solidarity. Facts of this kind should not be denied. The group can easily give the individual a courage, a bearing, and a dignity which may easily get lost in isolation. It can awaken within him the memory of being a man among men, but that does not prevent something else from being added, which he would not possess as an individual. Such unearned gifts may seem a special favor of the moment, but in the long run, there is a danger of the gift becoming a loss, since human nature has a weak habit of taking gifts for granted. In times of necessity, we demand them as a right instead of making the effort to obtain them ourselves. One sees this, unfortunately, only too plainly in the tendency to demand everything from the state without reflecting that the state consists of those very individuals who make the demands. There is an axiom about that, right? Whenever the state figures out that they can vote themselves money, that's when it dies. The logical development of this tendency leads to communism, where each individual enslaves the community and the latter is represented by a dictator, the slave owner. All primitive tribes, characterized by a communistic order of society, also have a chieftain over them with unlimited powers. The communist state is nothing other than an absolute monarchy in which there are no subjects but only serfs. That's socialism, right? This is another one of those common problems, right? Communism Communism is nobody is really in charge. We collectively are all in charge. And the only real communism actually is that there is no chairman. There is nobody calling the shots. There is everybody collectively calling shots, right? That is why communism is impossible to enact. The impossibility of everybody actually voting on something in accordance in a way that is going to lead to productivity is virtually nil. That is why we use representative government here. Socialism is this, right? Socialism is one guy in charge of all the things, including all the people. That's what socialists do, right? Fascism is the same thing. They just pretend to have a free market. They say, you get to succeed, you get to succeed. Socialism, they own the store, right? It is the property of the state. In in fascism, you own the store as long as you toe the line. And so that's just one of the problems with terminology. I mean, it's not communism, it's socialism. E. Identification with a cult hero. Another important identification underlying the transformation experience is that with the god or hero who is transformed in the sacred ritual. Many cult ceremonies are expressly intended to bring this identity about, an obvious example being the metamorphosis of a Pulius. The initiate, an ordinary human being, is elected to be Helios. He is crowned with a crown of palms and clad in a mystic mantle, whereupon the assembled crowd pays homage to him. The suggestion of the crowd brings about his identity with the god. The participation of the community can also take place in the following way. There is no apotheosis of the initiate, but the sacred action is recited, and then, in the course of long periods of time, psychic changes gradually occur in the individual participants. The Osiris cult offers an excellent example of this. At first, only Pharaoh participated in the transformation of the god, since he alone had an Osiris. But later, the nobles of the empire acquired an Osiris too, and finally, this development culminated in the Christian idea that everyone has an immortal soul and shares directly in the Godhead. In Christianity, the development was carried still further when the outer God or Christ gradually became the inner Christ of the individual believer, remaining one and the same through dwelling in many, though dwelling in many. This truth had already been anticipated by the psychology of totemism. Many exemplars of the totem animal are killed and consumed during the totem meals, and yet it is only the one who is being eaten, just as there is only one Christ child and one Santa Claus. There you go. In the mysteries, the individual undergoes an indirect transformation through his participation in the fate of the god. The transformation experience is also an indirect one into the Christian church, inasmuch as it is brought about by participation in something acted or recited. Here, the first form, the dramanon, is characteristic of the richly developed ritual of the Catholic Church. The second form, the recitation, the word or gospel, is practiced in the preaching of the word in Protestantism. F. Magical procedures. A further form of transformation is achieved through a rite used directly for this purpose. Instead of the transformation experience coming to one through participation in the rite is used for the express purpose of effecting the transformation. Let me dunk you under water and you will be reborn. It is thus becomes a sort of technique to which one submits oneself. For instance, a man is ill and consequently needs to be renewed. The renewal must happen to him from outside, and to bring this about, he is pulled through a hole in the wall at the head of his sickbed. And now he is reborn, or he is given another name, and thereby another soul. And then the demons no longer recognize him, or he has to pass through a symbolical death, or, grotesquely enough, he is pulled through a leathern cow, which devours him, so to speak, in front, and then expels him behind. or he undergoes an ablution or baptismal bath and miraculously changes into a semi divine being with a new character and an altered metaphysical destiny. G. Technical transformation. Besides the use of the rite in the magical sense, there are still other special techniques in which, in addition to the grace inherent in the rite, the personal endeavor of the initiate is needed in order to achieve the intended purpose. It is a transformation experience induced by technical means. The exercise is known in the East as yoga and in the West as exercita spiritualia, come in this category. These exercises represent special techniques prescribed in advance and intended to achieve a definite psychic effect, or at least promote it. This is true both of Eastern yoga and the methods practiced in the West. They are, therefore, technical procedures in the fullest sense of the word, elaborations of the originally natural processes of transformation. The natural or spontaneous transformations that occurred earlier, before there were any historical examples to follow, were thus replaced by techniques designed to induce the transformation by imitating the same sequence of events. I will try to give an idea of the way such techniques may have originated by relating a fairy story. I mean, imagine if you had almost drowned, and then when you made your way to the shore, you were like, I'm a new man. And then all of a sudden, there was once a queer old man who lived in a cave where he had sought refuge from the noise of the villages. He was reputed to be a sorcerer, and therefore he had disciples who hoped to learn the art of sorcery from him. But he himself was not thinking of any such thing. He was only seeking to know what it was that he did not know, but which he felt certain was always happening. After meditating for a very long time on that which is beyond meditation, he saw no other way of escape from his predicament than to take a piece of red chalk and draw all kinds of diagrams on the walls of his cave in order to find out that which he did not know might look like. After many attempts, he hit on the circle. That's right, he felt. And now for a quadrangle inside it, which made it better still. His disciples were curious, but all they could make out was that the old man was up to something, and they would have given anything to know what he was doing. But when they asked him, What are you doing there? He made no reply. Then they discovered the diagrams on the wall and said, That's it. And they all imitated the diagrams. But in doing so, they turned the whole process upside down without noticing it. They anticipated the result in the hope of making the process repeat itself, which had led to that result. This is how it happened then and how it still happens today, if that is not the absolute truth. Yes, indeed. H. Natural transformations, individuation. And as I have pointed out, in addition to the technical processes of transformation, there are also natural transformations. All ideas of rebirth are founded on this fact. Nature herself demands a death and a rebirth. As the alchemist Democritus says, nature rejoices in nature, nature subdues nature, nature rules over nature. There are natural transformation processes which simply happen to us, whether we like it or not, and whether we know it or not. Yes, these processes develop considerable psychic effects, which would be sufficient in themselves to make any thoughtful person ask himself what really happened to him. Like the old man in our fairy tale, he too will draw mandalas and seek shelter in their protective circle, in the perplexity and anguish of his self chosen prison, which he had deemed a refuge. He is transformed into a being akin to the gods. Mandalas are birthplaces, vessels of birth in the most literal sense, lotus flowers in which a Buddha comes to life. Sitting in the lotus seat, the yogi sees himself transfigured into an immortal. Natural transformation processes announce themselves mainly in dreams. Elsewhere, I presented a series of dream symbols of the process of individuation. They were dreams which, without exception, exhibited rebirth symbolism. In this particular case, there was a long drawn out process of inner transformation and rebirth into another being. This other being is the other person in ourselves, that larger and greater personality maturing within us, whom we have already met as the inner friend of the soul. That is why we take comfort whenever we find the friend and companion depicted in a ritual, an example being the friendship between Mithras and the sun god. This relationship is a mystery to the scientific intellect because the intellect is accustomed to regard these things unsympathetically. But if we made allowance for feeling, we would discover that it is the friend whom the sun god takes with him on his chariot, as shown in the monuments. It is the representation of a friendship between two men, which is simply the outer reflection of an inner fact. It reveals our relationship to that inner friend of the soul, into whom nature herself would like to change us. That other person, who we also are, and yet can never attain to completely. We are that pair of Dioscuri, one of whom is mortal and the other immortal, and who, though always together, can never be made completely one. The transformation processes strive to approximate them to one another, but our consciousness is aware of resistances because the other person seems strange and uncanny, and because we cannot get accustomed to the idea that we are not absolute master in our own house. We should prefer to always be I and nothing else. But we are confronted with an inner friend or foe, and whether he is our friend or foe depends on ourselves. Yes, indeed. You need not be insane to hear his voice. I say that you hear both sides of the argument, right? The spirit that we were talking about earlier, right? The positive and the negative that is the duality. You hear both sides of the argument. You should stay the same. You should change all the time, and you get to make the choice. Right? It's not insane to hear those voices. Now, if those voices are saying you should kill somebody, you seek help. Right? You need help with that voice. But everybody else, you hear that voice all of the time. I need to go do the clothes, or you need to go do the clothes. It normally refers to you in the third person. Whereas you're like, I need to go do the clothes. It'd be like, you need to do the clothes. And the other one's like, nah, just, you can sit here and just watch Netflix. And you hear it, and you're not crazy. It's not crazy to hear it. It's crazy to argue with it, but it's not crazy to hear it. On the contrary, it is the simplest and most natural thing imaginable. For instance, you can ask yourself a question to which he gives answer. The discussion is then carried on as in any other conversation. You can describe it as mere associating or talking to oneself, or as meditation in the sense used by the old alchemist, who referred to their interlocutor as alicium alium internum, a certain other one within. This form of colloquy with the friend of the soul was even admitted by Ignatius Loyola into the technique of his exercitia spiritualia, but with the limiting condition that only the person meditating is allowed to speak, whereas the inner responses are passed over as being merely human and therefore to be repudiated. This state of things has continued down to the present day. It is no longer a moral or metaphysical prejudice, but what is much worse, an intellectual one. The voice is explained as nothing but associating, pursued in a witless way, and running on and on without sense or purpose, like the works of a clock that has no dial. Or we say, it is only my own thoughts, even if, on closer inspection, it should turn out that they are thoughts which we either reject or had never consciously thought at all, as if everything psychic that is glimpsed by the ego had always formed part of it. Naturally, this hybris serves the useful purpose of maintaining the supremacy of ego consciousness, which must be safeguarded against dissolution into the unconscious. It breaks down ignominiously if ever the unconscious should choose to let some nonsensical idea become an obsession or to produce other psychogenic symptoms for which we would not like to accept responsibility on any account. Our attitude towards this inner voice alternates between two extremes. It is regarded either as undiluted nonsense or as the voice of God. It does not seem to occur to anyone that there might be something valuable in between. The other may be just as one sided in one way as the ego is in another. Not quite. And yet, the conflict between them may give rise to truth and meaning, but only if the ego is willing to grant the other its rightful personality. It has, of course, a personality anyway, just as have the voices of insane people. But a real colloquy becomes possible only when the ego acknowledges the existence of a partner to the discussion. That is true. That is true. Embracing makes a big difference. This cannot be expected of everyone because, after all, not everyone is a fit subject for the exercita spiritualia, nor can it be called a colloquy if someone speaks only to oneself or only addresses the other, as in the case of George Sand in her conversations with a spiritual friend. For 30 pages, she talks exclusively to herself, while one waits in vain for the other to reply. The colloquy of the exorcitia may be followed by that silent grace in which the modern doubter no longer believes. But what if it were the supplicated Christ himself who gave immediate answer in the words of the sinful human heart? What fearful abysses of doubt would then be opened? What madness should we not then have to fear? From this, one can understand that images of the gods are better mute and that ego consciousness had better believe in its own supremacy rather than go on associating. One can also understand why that inner friend so often seems to be our enemy and why he is so far off and his voice so low. For he who is near to him is near to the fire. Fire is a synonym for spirit. Something of this sort may have been in the mind of the alchemist who wrote, "Choose for your stone him through whom kings are honored in the crowns, and through whom physicians heal their sick, for he is near to the fire." The alchemist projected the inner event into an outer figure. So for them, the inner friend appeared in the form of the stone, of which the Tractus Aureus says, "Understand, ye sons of the wise, what this exceedingly precious stone crieth out to you. Protect me, and I will protect thee. Give me what is mine, that I may help thee." To the Aeschylus adds, "The seeker after truth hears both the stone and the philosopher, speaking as if out of one mouth." The philosopher is Hermes, and the stone is identical with Mercurius, the Latin Hermes. No. From the earliest times, and I've gone into extreme detail with that, but there is a big, big misunderstanding. It was common in the alchemical works. It was rampant in the Mysterium Conundionis of mistaking Mercurius and Mercurius, Mercurius and Mercurius, Mercury, Mercurius, and there's another one. Anyway, right? Mercurius is the spirit, right? It is Hermes. That is true. But it is both the positive and the negative. It moves in both directions, much like Mercury does, right? The binder between the as above and as below, much like Mercury would be, right? But Mercury in the text are actually talking about the decider. It is talking about the soul, the part that makes the decision between the two things. You hear two voices, right? You hear the voice of reason and you hear the voice of unreason. You hear the voice of change, you hear the voice of stasis. You hear the voice of positive, the voice of negative. Whatever particular appellation that you put on the binary, you do respond to it. Now, the one that you hear the most is the one that you feed the most. So, if you are feeding positivity into your life, you're going to hear the voice that leads to positivity more than the other one. But if you lead a negative life, you will hear the negative voice over the positive one. It's just the way it works. You attract that which you focus upon. And so Mercurius here and Hermes here. Hermes is not the philosopher, right? The stone is not identical with Mercurius. The stone is what you create whenever you bring yourself into balance. It is centered around your heart. And whenever you bring all of the various virtues and vices into accordance with each other, then you create the stone. It is not identical with Mercurius. Mercurius is a tool that you use to create the stone. It is completely different. Back to the text. From the earliest times, Hermes was the mystagogue and psychopomp of the alchemist, their friend and counselor who leads them to the goal of their work. He is like a teacher, mediating between the stone and the disciple. That would be the decider, right? If you're deciding between the stone and the disciple, in this particular instance, is positive and negative, right? The stone is immovable, the disciple is learnable. I mean, yeah, and that's not a good analogy, right? I don't even like it as an example. To others, the friend appears in the shape of Christ or Kadir or a visible or invisible guru or some other personal guide or leader figure. In this case, the colloquy is distinctly one sided. There is no inner dialogue, but instead the response appears as the action of the other, an example, as an outward event. The alchemist saw it in the transformation of the chemical substance. So, if one of them saw a transformation, he discovered it outside in matter, whose transformation cried out to him, as it were, I am the transformation. But some were clever enough to know it is my own transformation, not a personal transformation, but the transformation of what is mortal in me into what is immortal. It shakes off the husk that I am and awakens to a life of its own. It mounts the sun barge and may take me with it. This is a very ancient idea. In Upper Egypt, near Aswan, I once saw an ancient Egyptian tomb that had just been opened. Just behind the entrance door was a little basket made of reeds containing the withered body of a newborn infant wrapped in rags. Evidently, the wife of one of the workmen had hastily laid the body of her dead child in the nobleman's tomb at the last moment, hoping that, when he entered the sun barge in order to rise anew, it might share in his salvation because it had been buried in the holy precinct, within reach of divine grace. 3. A set of symbols illustrating the process of transformation. I have chosen as an example a figure that plays a great role in Islamic mysticism, namely Qadir, the verdant one. He appears in the 18th surah of the Quran, entitled The Cave. This entire surah is taken up with the rebirth mystery. The cave is the place of rebirth, that secret cavity in which one is shut up in order to be incubated and renewed. The Quran says of it, you might have seen the rising sun decline to the right of their cavern, and, as it said, go past them on the left, while they, the seven sleepers, stayed in the middle. The middle is the center, where the jewel reposes, where the incubation, or the sacrificial rite of the transformation takes place. The most beautiful development of this symbolism is to be found on Mithraic altarpieces and in alchemical pictures of the transformative substance, which is always shown between sun and moon. Representations of the crucifixion frequently follow the same type, and a similar symbolical arrangement is often found in the transformation or healing ceremonies of the Navajos. Just such a place in the center or of transformation is the cave in which those seven had gone to sleep, little thinking that they would experience a prolongation of life, verging on immortality. When they woke, they had slept 309 years. The legend has the following meaning. Anyone who gets into that cave, that is to say, into the cave which everyone has in himself, or into the darkness that lies behind consciousness, will find himself involved in, an, at first, unconscious process of transformation. Don't miss the number that was inside of the cave. By penetrating into the unconscious, he makes a connection with his unconscious contents. This may result in a momentous change of personality in the positive or negative sense. The transformation is often interpreted as a prolongation of the natural span of life, or as an earnest of immortality. The former is the case with many alchemists, notably Paracelsus in his treatise, the Vita Longa, and the latter is exemplified in the Eleusinian Mysteries. Those seven sleepers indicate by their sacred number that they are gods. They're inside of you. There are seven inside of you, and there is a cave in which you go into to balance out those seven who are transformed during sleep and thereby enjoy eternal youth or create eternal youth. This helps us, and not eternal, but long lasting. This helps us to understand at the outside that we are at set, that we are dealing with a mystery legend. The fate of the numinous figures recorded in its grips, the hearer, because the story gives expression to parallel processes in his own unconscious, which in that way are integrated with consciousness again. The repristinization in the original state is tantamount to attaining once more the freshness of youth. The story of the sleepers is followed by some moral observations which appear to have no connection with it. But this, and man, that's going to make me have to read the freaking Quran. I mean, I, the different versions of the legend sometimes speak of 7 and sometimes 8 disciples. Come on, are you kidding me? According to the account given in the Quran, the eighth is a dog. What is that backwards? The 8th through 18th surah mentions still other versions. Some will say the sleepers were 3, that dog was the 4th. Others, guessing at the unknown, will say they were 5, the dog was 6th. And yet others, 7, the dog was the 8th. And there is that exact same argument. Is it 3? Is it 6? Is it 7? Is it 8? What is the argument? It is evident, therefore, that the dog is to be taken into account. The dog is the cave. Would seem to be the instance of that characteristic wavering between 7 and 8, which I pointed out in Psychology and Alchemy. All right, I think we got the gist of that. So there is more than likely an entirely relevant connection between the moral observations which are in this story and what is being ignored here. There is almost certainly going to be a moral constellation of that. And that is almost certainly going to be relevant to the balancing of the virtues and the vices. Almost certainly. Now, I haven't read it, so I can't tell you with absolute certainty, but that is almost enough to make me read that book. But this apparent irrelevance is deceptive. In reality, these edifying comments are just what are needed by those who cannot be reborn themselves and have to be content with moral conduct. That is to say, with adherence to the law. Very often, behavior prescribed by rule is a substitute for spiritual transformation. These edifying observations are then followed by the story of Moses and his servant Yeshua ben Nun. And Moses said to his servant, I will not cease from my wanderings until I have reached that place where 2 seas meet, even though I journey for 80 years. But when he had reached that place where the 2 seas meet, they forgot their fish, and it took its way through the stream to the sea. And when they had journeyed past this place, Moses said to his servant, Bring us breakfast, for we are weary from this journey. But the other replied, See what has befallen me. When we were resting by the rocks, I forgot the fish. Only Satan can have put it out of my mind, and in a wondrous fashion, it took its way to the sea. That is a perfect example of the victim mentality, which is rampant in the Satan mentality, right? The co-equal to God who is keeping you from achieving. You're holding me back by temptation and vice. No, you were making the decision to succumb to that temptation and vice. You forgot the fish. Satan didn't steal it. And then Moses said, This is the place that we seek. And they went back the way they had come. And when they had found one of our servants, whom we had endowed with our grace and our wisdom, Moses said to him, Shall I follow you, that you may teach me for my guidance some of the wisdom you have learnt? But he answered, You will not bear with me, for how should you bear patiently with things you cannot comprehend? And Moses said, If Allah wills, you shall find me patient. I shall not in anything disobey you. And he said, If you are bent on following me, you must ask no questions about anything, till I myself speak to you concerning it. The 2 set forth, but as soon as they embarked, Moses' companion bored a hole in the bottom of the ship. A strange thing you have done, exclaimed Moses. Is it to drown her passengers that you have bored a hole in her? Did I not tell you, he replied, that you would not bear with me? Pardon my forgetfulness, said Moses. Do not be angry with me on this account. They journeyed on until they fell in with a certain youth. Moses' companion slew him, and Moses said, You have killed an innocent man who has done no harm. Surely you have committed a wicked crime. Did I not tell you, he replied, that you would not bear with me? Moses said, If ever I question you again, abandon me, for then I should deserve it. They traveled on until they came to a certain city. They asked the people for some food, but the people declined to receive them as their guests. There, They found a wall. There they found a wall on the point of falling down. The other raised it up, and Moses said, "Had you wished, you could have demanded payment for your labors." "Now the time has arrived when we must depart," said the other. "But first I will explain to you these acts of mine which you could not bear in patience. Know that the ship belonged to some poor fisherman. I damaged it because in the rear was a king who was taking every ship by force. As for the youth, his parents both are true believers, and we fear, like for real, that's better, right? You took it and you sank it, and that's better than him knowing what happened to his ship. That's better than him giving it to the king. So at least the king knows, hey, this guy will at least give me the tribute I demand. Maybe I don't cut off his head, right? It's better that I take it and I sink it. What? As for the youth, his parents are both true believers, and we feared lest he should plague them with his wickedness and unbelief. It was our wish that their Lord should grant them another in his place, a son more righteous and more filial. So, instead of allowing free will to go free will's way and the parents to be tempted in the way that God obviously wanted them to be, you killed the kid. Okay. As for the wall, it belonged to two orphan boys in the city whose father was an honest man. Beneath it their treasure is buried. Your Lord decreed in his mercy that they should dig out their treasure when they grew to manhood. What I did was not done by caprice. This is the meaning of the things you could not bear with in patience. Okay, so out of the three, you got one decent outflow, right? Out of the three examples, you got something halfway decent. Dumb ego indeed. This story is an amplification and elucidation of the legend of the seven sleepers and the problem of rebirth. Moses is the man who seeks the man on the quest. On this pilgrimage, he is accompanied by his shadow, the servant or lower man, pneumatikos and sarikos, in two individuals. Yeshua is the son of Nun, which is a name for fish, suggesting that Yeshua had his origin in the depths of the waters, in the darkness of the shadow world. The critical place is reached where the two seas meet, which is interpreted as the Isthmus of Suez, where the western and eastern seas come close together. In other words, it is that place of the middle, which we have already met in the symbolic preamble, but whose significance was not recognized at first by the man and his shadow. They had forgotten their fish, the humble source of nourishment. The fish refers to Nun, the father of the shadow, of the carnal man, who comes from the dark world of the Creator. For the fish came back alive again and leapt out of the basket in order to find its way back into its homeland, the sea. In other words, the animal ancestor and creator of life separates himself from the conscious man, an event which amounts to loss of the instinctive psyche. This process is a symptom of dissociation well known in the psychopathology of the neuroses. It is always connected with one sidedness of the conscious attitude. In view of the fact, however, that neurotic phenomena are nothing but exaggerations of normal processes, it is not to be wondered at that very similar phenomena can also be found within the scope of the normal. It is the question of that well-known loss of soul among primitives, as described above in the section on diminution of the personality in scientific language, and abaissement des niveaux mentaux. None has many meanings, fish being only one of them. It can also mean child, student, or prince. I remember that from our study. Moses and his servant soon noticed what has happened. Moses had sat down, worn out and hungry. Evidently, he had a feeling of insufficiency for which a physiological explanation is given. Fatigue is one of the most regular symptoms of loss of energy or libido. The entire process represents something very typical, namely, the failure to recognize a moment of crucial importance, a motif which we encounter in a great variety of mythical forms. Moses realizes that he has unconsciously found the source of life and then lost it again, which might well regard a remarkable intuition. The fish, they had intended to eat is the content of the unconscious by which the connection with the origin is reestablished. He is the reborn one who has awakened to new life. This came to pass, as the commentaries say, through the contact with the water of life by slipping back into the sea. The fish once more becomes content with the unconscious, and its offspring are distinguished by having only one eye and half a head. There was so much contextual understanding required to read Old Hebrew. It's no wonder we have so many odd interpretations. Yeah. Yeah. Like I was unaware until recently that the Septuagint, the understanding that is in the Bible as the Old Testament in most Bibles is like a very late thing. Like very late. There are older translations that are not in accordance with that at all. I mean, that are actually of straight descent from the Hebrew people. And that's a very interesting thing to discover, right? I thought that it was, even with all of the understandings, right? All of they lied, right? There was so much lying going on. I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that they completely changed the New Testament. Like the first five books at a minimum, completely changed. Yeah, commissioned by Ptolemy for Greek-speaking Jews in Egypt. Right? Yeah, like very late, very recent. The alchemists too speak of a strange fish in the sea, the round fish lacking bones and skin, which symbolizes the round element, the germ of the animate stone of the Filius Philosophorum. The water of life has its parallel in the aqua permanens of alchemy. This water is extolled as vivifying, besides which it has the property of dissolving all solids and coagulating all liquids. The Quran commentaries state that on the spot where the fish disappeared, the sea was turned into solid ground, whereon the tracks of the fish could still be seen. On the island thus first Kadir was sitting, in the place of the middle. A mystical interpretation says that he was sitting on a throne consisting of light between the upper and lower sea. Now, see, that makes sense to me. Sitting on a throne consisting of light between the as above and the as below is definitely something that I can talk about. The appearance of Kadir seems to be mysteriously connected with the disappearance of the fish. Yeah, it looks almost as if he himself had been the fish. This conjecture is supported by the fact that the commentaries relegate the source of life to the place of darkness. The depths of the sea are dark. Mare tenebrosatias. The darkness has its parallel in the alchemical negredo, which occurs after the conjunctio. No, when the female takes the male into herself. The negredo is the process of darkening, and so, yes, okay. From the negredo issues the soul. Like, the negredo is the beginning part of purification in the alchemical process, which I am working on, but which has been released in at least a short form in the greenstone and in a different form in unconventional beliefs. Uh, but the Negredo is the first step. It is recognizing the dark elements within oneself and raising them up to be consumed into the fire, right? Bringing the light into the dark. And then you got to bring the dark into the light a little bit. You bring it down and you work through the other side. Uh, and that's the albedo. And then when you get through the Negredo and into the albedo, which is the whitening, then you get into the rubido, which is the combination of the two, the reddening. And then you get into the citrinalis, which is the actual projection. That is the fourth part. And yeah, so this conjecture is a place of darkness. The depths of the sea are dark. Wait. Okay, so it's not after it is after the conjunctio, kind of, because that is the process starting is whenever the two meet and mix and you realize that there is a problem, that is when it begins. And so true. But the conjunctio is kind of the whole process by which it is combined. And so it is the beginning of the conjunctio as opposed to the end of the conjunctio. From the negredo issues the stone. That is not true. From the rubido issues the stone that is the citronellus, right? When you create the stone, that is when you get to project. After the rubido, negredo, albedo, rubido, citronellus. issues the stone, the symbol of the immortal self. Moreover, its first appearance is likened to fish eyes. Kadir may well be a symbol of the self. Yes, he may well be a symbol of the self indeed. His qualities signalize him as such. He is said to have been born in a cave, an example of the darkness. He is the long lived one who continually renews himself, like Elijah. Like Osiris, he is dismembered at the end of time by Antichrist, but he is able to restore himself to life. He is analogous to the second Adam, with whom the reanimated fish is identified. He is a counselor, a paraclete, Brother Kadia. Anyway, Moses accepts him as a higher consciousness and looks up to him for instruction. Then follow those incomprehensible deeds for which show how ego consciousness reacts to the superior guidance of the self through the twists and turns of fate. To the initiate, who is capable of transformation, it is a comforting tale. To the obedient believer, an exhortation not to murmur against Allah's incomprehensible omnipotence. Qadir symbolizes not only the higher wisdom, but also a way of acting, which is in accord with this wisdom and transcends reason. The self, the student of the initiate, the anointed one, etc. Yeah. Yeah. The one who is seeking to become, even. Anyone hearing such a mystery tale will recognize himself in the questing Moses and the forgetful Yeshua. The tale shows him how the immortality bringing rebirth comes about. Characteristically, it is neither Moses nor Yeshua who is transformed, but the forgotten fish. Where the fish disappears, there is the birthplace of Kadir. The immortal being issues from something humble and forgotten, indeed, from a wholly improbable source. This is the familiar motif of the hero's birth and need not be documented here. Anyone who knows the Bible will think of Isaiah 53:2, where the servant of God is described, and of the gospel stories of the Nativity. The nourishing character of the transformative substance or deity is borne out by numerous cult legends. Christ is the bread, Osiris the wheat, Mondamin the maize, etc. These symbols coincide with a psychic fact, which, obviously, from the point of view of consciousness, has the significance merely of something to be assimilated, but whose real nature is overlooked. The fish symbol shows immediately what this is. It is the nourishing influence of unconscious contents, which maintain the vitality of consciousness by a continual influx of energy. For consciousness does not produce its energy by itself. What is capable of transformation is just this root of consciousness, which, inconspicuous and almost invisible, an example, unconscious, though it is, provides consciousness with all its energy. Since the unconscious gives us the feeling that it is something alien, a non ego, it is quite natural that it should be symbolized by an alien figure. Thus, on the one hand, it is the most insignificant of things, while on the other, so far as it potentially contains that round wholeness which consciousness lacks, it is the most significant of all. This round thing is the great treasure that lies hidden in the cave of the unconscious, and his personification is this personal being who represents the higher unity of conscious and unconscious. It is a figure comparable to Hiranyagarbha, Purusha Atman, and the mystic Buddha. For this reason, I have elected to call it the self, by which I understand a psychic totality and at the same time a center, neither of which coincides with the ego but includes it. Just as a larger circle encloses a smaller one. The intuition of immortality, which makes itself felt during the transformation, is connected with the peculiar nature of the unconscious. It is, in a sense, non spatial and non temporal. The empirical proof of this occurrence is the so called telepathic phenomena, which are still denied by hyper skeptical critics, although in reality they are much more common than is generally supposed. The feeling of immortality, it seems to me, has its origin in a peculiar feeling of extension in space and time, and I am inclined to regard the deification rites and the mysteries as a projection of this same psychic phenomenon. The character of the self, as a personality, comes out very plainly in the Qadir legend. This feature is most strikingly expressed in the non Quranic stories about Qadir, of which Vollers gives some telling examples. During my trip through Kenya, the headman of our safari was a Somali who had been brought up in the Sufi faith. To him, Qadir was in every way a living person, and he assured me that I might at any time meet Qadir, because I was, as he put it, Matuya Katabu, a man of the book, meaning the Quran. He had gathered from our talks that I knew the Quran better than he did himself, which was, by the way, not saying a great deal. For this reason, he regarded me as Islamu. He told me I might meet Qadir in the street in the shape of a man, or he might appear to me during the night as a pure white light, or, he smilingly picked up a blade of grass, the verdant one might even look like that. He said he himself had once been comforted and helped by Qadir when he could not find a job after the war and was suffering want. One night, while he slept, he dreamt he saw a bright white light near the door and he knew it was Qadir. Quickly leaping to his feet, in the dream, he reverentially saluted him with the words, Salam alaikum, peace be with you. And then he knew that his wish would be fulfilled. He added that a few days later, he was offered the post as headman of the safari by a firm of outfitters in Nairobi. Chatting with Sufis on Deobams was very interesting. I bet it would be. I mean, that I have been very hesitant to get into that particular thing because of the volatile nature of the normally associated. Right? Well, it's not that Christianity doesn't have its wild people, right? I very much put my life on the line when I wrote that book, but not necessarily to the same degree of fervency that we see expressly given in that book. This shows that even in our day, Qadir lives on in the religion of the people as friend, advisor, comforter, and teacher of revealed wisdom. The position assigned to him by dogma was, according to my Somali, that of Malaika Kwanza Yamanga, first angel of God, a sort of angel of the face, and angelos in the true sense of the word, a messenger. Dao is a Taoist form. One couldn't expect to find Muslims there, but they are, and they aren't all like the stereotype. I would imagine that any of the Muslims that were on a Taoist website would be the more reasonable ones, right? I would expect them to at least be trying to understand other viewpoints if they are doing that, and so they would probably be along the lines of the more reasonable ones. I mean, again, there are fanatics on either side, so it's not about that. Uh, but yeah, like I imagine browsing on the Taoist forums would probably be interesting in and of itself. Qadir's character as a friend explains the subsequent parts of the 18th surah, which reads as follows. They will ask you about Dul Karnin. Say, I will give you an account of him. We made him mighty in the lands and gave him means to achieve all things. He journeyed on a certain road until he reached the west and saw the sun setting in a pool of black mud. Hard by, he found a certain people. De la Carnine, we said, you must either punish them or show them kindness. He replied, the wicked we shall surely punish. Then they shall return to their Lord and be sternly punished by him. As for those that have faith and do good works, we shall bestow on them a rich reward and deal indulgently with them. He then journeyed along another road until he reached the east and saw a sun rising upon a people whom we had utterly exposed to its flaming rays. So we did, and we had full knowledge of all the forces at his command. Then he followed yet another route until he came between the two mountains and found a people who could barely understand a word. The Lurkarnin, they said, Gog and Magog are ravaging this land. Build us a rampart against them, and we will pay you tribute. You must be in Turkey. He replied, the power which my lord has given me is better than any tribute. Lend me a force of laborers, and I will raise a rampart between you and them. Come, bring me blocks of iron. Blocks of iron, you say? He dammed up the valley between the two mountains and said, Ply your bellows. and when the iron blocks were red with heat, he said, "Bring me molten brass to pour upon them." Gog and Magog could not scale it, nor could they dig their way through it, he said. "This is a blessing from my Lord, but when my Lord's promise is fulfilled, he will level it to dust. The promise of my Lord is true. On that day, we will let them come in tumultuous throngs. The trumpet shall be sounded, and we will gather them all together. On that day, hell shall be laid bare before the unbelievers who have turned a blind eye to my admonition and a deaf ear to my warning." Here, we see another instance of that lack of coherence which is not uncommon in the Quran. How are we to account for this apparently abrupt transition to Belarkanin, the two-horned one, that is to say, Alexander the Great? Apart from the unheard of anachronism, Muhammad's chronology in general leaves much to be desired. One does not quite understand why Alexander is brought in here at all. But it has to be borne in mind that Kadir and Dula Karnin are the great pair of friends, altogether comparable to the Dioscuri, as Vollers rightly emphasizes. The psychological connection may therefore be presumed to be as follows. Moses has a profoundly moving experience of the self, which brought unconscious processes before his eyes with overwhelming clarity. Afterwards, when he comes to his people, the Jews, who are counted among the infidels, and wants to tell them about his experience, he prefers to use the form of a mystery legend. Instead of speaking about himself, he speaks about the two-horned one. Since Moses himself is also horned, the substitution of Del Karnin appears plausible. Then he has to relate the history of this friendship and describe how Kadir helped his friend. Dul Karnin makes his way to the setting of the sun and then to its rising. That is, he describes the way of the renewal of the sun through death and darkness to a new resurrection. All this again indicates that it is Kadir who not only stands by man in his bodily needs, but also helps him to attain rebirth. The Quran, it is true, makes no distinction in this narrative between Allah, who is speaking in the first person plural, and Kadir. But it is clear that this section is simply a continuation of the helpful actions described previously, from which it is evident that Kadir is a symbolization or incarnation of Allah. The friendship between Kadir and Alexander plays an especially prominent part in the commentaries, as does also the connection with the prophet Elijah. Vollers does not hesitate to extend the comparison to that other pair of friends, Gilgamesh and Enkidu. To sum up, then, Moses has to recount the deeds of the two friends to his people in the manner of an impersonal mystery legend. Psychologically, this means that the transformation has to be described or felt as happening to the other, although it is Moses himself who, in his experience with Kadir, stands in Dul Karnin's place. He has to name the latter instead of telling it himself in the story. This can hardly be accidental, for the great psychic danger, which is always connected with individuation or the development of the self, lies in the identification of ego consciousness with the self. This produces an inflation which threatens consciousness with dissolution. All the more primitive or older cultures show a fine sense for the perils of the soul and for the dangerousness and general unreliability of the gods. That is, they have not yet lost their psychic instinct for the barely perceptible and yet vital processes going on in the background, which can hardly be said of our modern culture. To be sure, we have before our eyes as a warning just such a pair of friends distorted by inflation, Nietzsche and Zarathustra. But the warning has not been heeded. And what are we to make of Faust and Mephistopheles? The Faustian hybris is already the first step towards madness. The fact that the unimpressive beginning of the transformation in Faust is a dog and not an edible fish, and that the transformed figure is the devil and not a wise friend, endowed with all grace and all wisdom, might, I am inclined to think, offer a key to our understanding of the highly enigmatic Germanic soul. Without entering into other details of the text, I would like to draw attention to one more point: the building of the rampart against Gog and Magog, also known as Yajuj and Majuj. This motif is a repetition of Kadir's last deed in the previous episode, the rebuilding of the town wall. But this time the wall is to be a strong defense against Gog and Magog. The passage may possibly refer to Revelation 27. And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for battle. The number of those whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city. Here, Dol Karnim takes over the role of Kadir and builds an unscalable rampart for the people living between two mountains. This is obviously the same place in the middle which is to be protected against Gog and Magog, the featureless, hostile masses. Psychologically, it is again a question of the self, enthroned in the place of the middle and referred to in Revelation as the beloved city, Jerusalem, the center of the earth. The self is the hero, threatened already at birth by envious collective forces, the jewel that is coveted by all and arouses jealous strife. And finally, the God who is dismembered by the old evil power of darkness. In its psychological meaning, individuation is an opus contra naturam, which creates a horror vacui in the collective layer and is only too likely to collapse under the impact of the collective forces of the psyche. The mystery legend of the two helpful friends promises protection to him who has found the jewel on his quest. But there will come a time when, in accordance with the law's providence, even the iron rampart will fall to pieces. Namely, on the day when the world comes to an end, or, psychologically speaking, when individual consciousness is extinguished in the waters of darkness. That is to say, when a subjective end of the world is experienced. And this is meant the moment when consciousness sinks back into the darkness from which it originally emerged, like Kadir's Island, the moment of death. The legend then continues along eschatological lines. On the day, the last day of the day of last judgment, the light returns to eternal light and darkness to eternal darkness. The opposites are separated, and a timeless state of permanence sets in, which, because of the absolute separation of opposites, is nevertheless one of supreme tension, and therefore corresponds to the improbable initial state. This is in contrast to the view which sees the end as a complexio oppositorum. With this prospect of eternity, paradise and hell, the 18th Surah comes to an end. In spite of its apparently disconnected and elusive character, it gives an almost perfect picture of a psychic transformation of or rebirth, which today, with our greater psychological insight, we would recognize as an individuation process. Because of the great age of the legend and the Islamic prophet's primitive cast of mind, the process takes place entirely outside the sphere of consciousness and is projected in the form of a mystery legend of a friend or a pair of friends and the deeds they perform. That is why all so elusive and lacking in logical sequence. Nevertheless, the legend expresses the obscure archetype of transformation so admirably that the passionate religious eros of the Arab finds it completely satisfying. It is for this reason that the figure of Qadir plays such an important part in Islamic mysticism. And that is going to bring us to the end of On Rebirth. Hopefully, I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a series of somewhat difficult topics. I understand that I do hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relate those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. I don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, most of this that needed to be talked about more, we stopped and talked about. And so I don't have a whole lot to wrap up with. So if you have found value in this, I ask that you do all of the wonderful things down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that is stated, if you put it in the box and it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you truly found value, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of one of my books, or reaching out to me through any of the links that are provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace. Have a good one. Thanks for hanging out.